Welcome to Chapter 22, Evolution. During this module, you're going to be learning concepts like natural selection, history of the Earth, evidence for evolution, how mutations drive evolution, and how humans evolve through time. Again, be sure that you are clicking all of the videos embedded or hyperlinks that you see and answering all the polls that are embedded in this as well. This video is a good review of Chapter 22 if you're not very familiar with the concepts of evolution. I suggest taking a look at this and make sure that you're familiar with all the concepts that are in this video. I typically like to ask students if they know how old the Earth is before we get going in this chapter. It's really important to know how old the Earth is because this process is so slow and it's very difficult to imagine this kind of time span, especially since we only live typically 70, 80, 90 years. So take a quick look and answer this question before moving forward. This video gives a good visualization of the history of the Earth and relates it to your own wingspan. It might be easier to think about the history of the Earth like a clock. So if you take a look, you can see when the first rocks formed, first prokaryotes like bacteria, and then look how long it took from first prokaryotes all the way till oxygen in the atmosphere. So there's a long history where there was no free oxygen, so there was no way that eukaryotes could have been around, because eukaryotes need oxygen to live, like us. And then there was, time span from first eukaryotes that were single-celled till first multicellars that was pretty lengthy as well. And then from there on, you can kind of see first animals, land plants, flowers, and then us, which you can see we've barely been here just for a little tiny piece of history when you're talking about the total history of the Earth. Just watch the first 10 minutes or so of the video How the Earth Was Made, Birth of the Earth. It just gives a good visualization on what was happening and what the Earth looked like at the very beginning. It's a little bit easier than just reading a paragraph about it or maybe even seeing a picture. Feel free to watch more if you'd like, but I know time is not on everyone's side, so as long as you watch the first 10 minutes, that's okay. It's important to distinguish a theory in science compared to when people say it casually in everyday language. A theory in science has an abundance of evidence to support it and cannot be disproven by current technology. Whereas a theory in everyday language is when people usually have just a guess. So this is very important to understand whenever we start talking about theories like evolution, where there's an abundance of evidence that supports it. Evolution by natural selection is one of the most important things you will learn about biology, and if you don't understand, it makes it very difficult to understand this whole course. It's a very simple concept where having the most advantageous or sometimes best trait, sometimes students say, for an environment will help you survive and then pass those genes on. Click this link and run through the simulation of this peppered moth natural selection activity. This is actually real research that was done about a century ago, before and after the Industrial Revolution, and it's a classic example of how natural selection works. It's again important to note that it really all depends on the environment you're in. So it might be advantageous in one environment to have a characteristic, but not another. So once you click through this, I think you'll understand that point a little bit better. Another classic example of natural selection deals with Darwin's finches. He observed all kinds of different finches living on different parts of the island and noticed that they all looked very similar but had just different variable beak sizes depending on the types of food they ate. So there might be some finches with large beaks for cracking nuts or small beaks for eating insects. The point is that those beak sizes changed because of the environment they were in and the food sources that were readily available. So if you had a smaller beak size and all that was around was insects, then the smaller beak size finches lived, whereas maybe larger beak size ones died off. So hence, in one area, that started to change the finches' beaks to just be smaller. Whereas maybe different other parts of the island, it was more like big nuts that they had to crack open, so having a bigger beak was a little bit more advantageous. So in those areas of the islands, and finches would start to evolve to have these larger beak sizes. I've given you a few examples of natural selection so far, so I want you to think of a couple on your own. You'll be addressing these in this week's discussion, so be sure to jot a few ideas down in your notes. Now that you've watched the video on antibiotic resistance, this slide should make a lot more sense on why penicillin doesn't work as well as it used to. Some bacteria just happen to have a mutation that allows it to survive and withstand penicillin. So this is why we have to develop new antibiotics to try to kill off some of these bacteria that are a little bit more strong now. So this is becoming a real problem in the healthcare industry, where you see problems like MRSA infections and C. diff that are really causing havoc in hospitals. This is just another example of how natural selection works with bacteria. And in this case, it goes through tuberculosis and the epidemic that is happening in Russia. It's important to know that evolution occurs in populations and not you individually. So you will never evolve, but populations of humans do. So a classic example of this would be the evolution of lactose tolerance. So 10,000 years ago, it was normal for humans to be intolerant. They could not digest lactose, so milk and cheese and dairy. But then a random mutation came about in the population, and that started to spread through the population as reproduction, and that kind of went through populations. And that was a benefit because then that gave humans a different dietary type of nutrition. So this is how populations of humans evolved to digest lactose. So that's a classic example of how this occurs with us. A common misconception about evolution is that it's working towards perfection, and it doesn't. So evolution has a lot of caveats where things are not perfect, so we're not always working towards a better organism per se. So we have these things called trade-offs, which when you watch this video about evolutionary trade-offs, you'll understand what this concept's about. So think of some other examples too besides what the video gives. For example, like what's good and bad about walking upright. So humans, of course, walk upright for use of hands or seeing long distances. But the trade-off is then we begin to have back problems or slip discs in our vertebrae because we are standing and gravity is kind of pushing down. So again, evolution led us to walk upright, which sounds like a good thing, but that's not perfect walking upright. Mutations are what really drive evolution. You'll notice on this slide I say mutations can be good or bad, but they also can be neutral and have no effect on an organism. Oftentimes that's what they are usually. And in this picture you can see a bad mutation, the two-headed snake. And that's the ones people usually think about the most, the ones that cause disease or illnesses or problems. But it's important to note that there are many mutations that are good. You'll be doing a lactose intolerance activity this week in your Canvas module that will explain how the mutation to digest lactose around 10,000 years ago was an example of a good mutation that allowed us to digest milk, cheeses, yogurts, and other things. Here are 5 pieces of evidence that support evolution. And I'm very brief in this slide and the next couple slides, so it might be a good idea to take a look in this chapter in your book and read for a little bit more detail. But as you can see, we have some concepts like biogeography, fossil evidence, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and molecular biology that really solidifies evolution and everything about it. The one that's probably most important or really solidifies it is the molecular biology nowadays because of DNA and amino acid evidence and how we can compare this from one organism to the next is really solid evidence for evolution. Another example of this would be how mammals have evolved from one area to another. So if you think about places like Australia, where there's a lot of non-placental marsupial mammals like kangaroos, versus the United States where most of our mammals are placental. So this is a good example of how species have evolved in different geographic regions and times, and of course you think about how the plates have moved our continents around, so this is why you have those organisms that are mostly in Australia versus like North America. So it's just a little bit about distribution of species over spaces through time. Radiometric dating is a very precise method that can calculate how old an organism is. Usually we test the rocks around the fossils and date the rock. Depending on the dating, it can be, give or take 10,000, 20,000 years, which sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of the history of the Earth is really very close. So there are different types like carbon dating and argon dating, depending on how old the organism is and what we need to test it for. So this is a good way we can track what organisms have been around for a very long time or were around a long time ago versus more modern. So if you look at the next couple slides, there's examples of transition fossils and then fossils in layers, so we can figure out, what was around early history of the Earth versus more modern history. So it gives a good example of how evolution has worked through time. My next slide gives examples of homologous structures. And basically it just shows how related organisms have the same kinds of structures, but maybe just have adapted differently to different selection pressures, so whether it's swimming or flying or walking. But the point is that the structures are the same. So the same bone structures, humerus, ulna, radius, so on and so forth. It's just that they've adapted because of different environments. So it's a good way to compare different organisms and ancestry throughout time. The next couple slides show a little bit about comparative embryology. So it's very easy to compare when they're in an adult form, as you'll see on the next slide, but when you compare embryos, they look very similar. And the point of this is we all came from a common ancestor, so there's a lot of commonality in our embryos. We all look very similar when we're just starting to develop. But of course, the different genes and DNA in each organism will start to change one organism into one form and another. But again, the point of this is just to show a little bit of common ancestry and how we all came from this common ancestor. As I stated before, comparing DNA or amino acids really solidifies how closely related organisms are. But I want to be very clear that this helps us show how close we are, but does not mean one came from the other. So common misconception is humans evolved from chimps, but that is just not true. We are related, so almost kind of like cousins maybe, but we did not come from chimps, nor did they come from us. So we have a common ancestor where one branch went off onto chimps and another branch went off to us. And that's very important to note, so you know that evolution is not linear either. So it's kind of like a tree. So just depending on the environment and the different pressures, chimps kind of evolved the way that they did today, and of course we had maybe a little different environment we were in, and so we evolved a different way. So that's just kind of how things work. A cladogram is fairly easy to construct from a character matrix. So in the table we have a wide variety of characteristics. The zeros represent that the organism does not have the characteristic, and 1 means they do. So when you construct the cladogram, you'll notice lampreys are all the way left because they do not possess any of those characteristics, whereas humans, all the way to the right, possess them all. So when you see jaws on the cladogram picture below, everything after jaws has jaws, whereas everything before doesn't. So a lamprey does not have jaws, whereas sharks, salamanders, lizards, tigers, gorillas, and humans do. This image is called a Hillis plot, which is a phylogenetic tree showing everything that's been identified on Earth. As you can tell over by the animals, it says you are here, and it's really hard to read, I know, but this is pretty amazing to see how everything has all branched off from one common ancestor. This is a PBS Nova documentary about the evolution of humans, and it's about an hour long, so I wouldn't expect you to watch the whole thing, but if you have time, it's really interesting, so I'd say try to if you can. But if not, just watch about the first 10 minutes or so. It gives a good comparison of humans versus Neanderthals. Also wanted to mention that we did live at the same time as Neanderthals. Sometimes people think that we evolved from them, but we didn't. We lived together, and we kind of came in contact with each other here and there. And there's proof of it in our DNA. So if you get your DNA tested, you might find out that you have a percentage of your DNA that's Neanderthal. For example, for myself, I got my DNA tested, and about 3% of my DNA is Neanderthal DNA. Just think about some of the examples that sets primates apart from other animals. So if you think about us and how we have opposable thumbs and nails, binocular vision, which means the way we look in depth perception, and our complex learning behaviors and cultural differences. So this is how we've evolved the way we are today compared to why other animals maybe are the way they are, and why we'll continue to evolve the way we do. You don't need to memorize all these species on this chart, but I do want you to be familiar with how to read it. So if you look Homo sapiens, like us, and the little tiny purple bar there, it just shows how long we've been around. So not very long, only about 200, 300,000 years according to fossil record that we dated. And if you look at other ones, so you see some Australopithecus genuses there, and you can see Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and how some were, a little bit older. And if you look at, again, Homo erectus, how long they roamed the earth, way longer than we've been here. And they went extinct for some reason or another, which we're not sure of. So it's just kind of an interesting way to look at it, sort of as a tree of life and the natural history of what we call hominins, which would be human-like ancestors. Take a look at this website and start to get familiar with this a little, as we'll be using it in Lab 3. It's really interesting, has lots of information, so if you have more questions about human evolution, it's a great site to go to learn about natural history, lots of evidence, all kinds of research, and you can even get involved and become an intern with the Smithsonian, so there's an area that you can look for that as well. There are many misconceptions about evolution. One that you commonly hear is we evolved from chimps, which is just not true whatsoever. I'm not sure where this actually stemmed from even, but we did not evolve from chimps. I make that very clear. We are kind of like cousins to them, so we had a common ancestor where they branched kind of one way on the tree and we branched another way. Make sure you follow this link to read about a few more evolutionary misconceptions, and pick one to answer in your study guide question for Unit 1 or your collaboration.